Hello, regulation theory students. Dr. Conway back for lesson 5 on rationales for regulation of free markets. You recall that our course narrative has started off with this question of free markets, right? And how if we ever had completely free markets, they would be relatively hazardous environments for us all to live in. But there's more than just regulating free markets to protect from the hazards that we're dealing with in this program, but rather there are a wide range of hazards that societies, governments like the Canadian government use regulation to try to address. So at this point in the course, I wanted to return to that notion, but speak to you about the various categories of regulation of free markets and what the purpose of those are. Okay, so that we understand that and we can situate it in the discussions that we've been having to this point. All right, so let's look at this particular topic. So we're looking at regulating market competition, regulating market instability, regulating for missing markets, and regulating for undesirable market results. Those are the 4 categories that I'll talk to you about to give you a sense of the breadth of regulation in society and how regulation, in addition to protecting some exposure harms in our society, particularly in the 3 classes of chemicals we deal with, there are all kinds of harms that regulation attempts to address, and they're not all related, obviously, to our field of work, but we need to situate our field of work in this broader context, all right? And that's the role of just sort of giving a landscape of regulation the way the regulation theory course does, all right? So let's look at this. So last time we talked about public and private interest theories of regulation. Now this is a set of really of theoretical assumptions as to why free markets get regulated and why regulation has tended to cluster into 4 areas of protecting the market from itself, so to speak, in addition to protecting societies from harm. I cite two areas because you will recall that in our private interest school, they argued that a lot of what occurred in regulation was in fact, public interest, but public interest described in a unique way. Public interest described from the perspective of protecting private interests, right? And so there's those two aspects of regulation. There's public interest to protect citizens from the market, protect citizens from unsafe chemical products in our case. But on the other side, there's also regulation to protect the free market from itself. All right. And what the implications of that would be if we did not have regulation, we'll talk about as we go through. All right. Let's take a look at market power. We know that excessive market power is most associated with monopolies or oligopolies. But there can be other forms of market power that can become abusive, such as with the case of price collusion, all right? And this is something that the government regulates quite regularly, right? If they don't regulate prices the way that we do with the CRTC, Canadian Radio and Telecommunications Commission, they're regulating the size of a company. So when Google wants to buy Fitbit, the governments take a look at that and say, is that going to create a monopolistic or an oligopolistic situation, right? Because under those conditions, of course, we can get elevated prices. Where there's no competition in a free market system, there's an opportunity for price gouging, right? There's an opportunity for price fixing, for raising prices, for basically making it harder for consumers to access the types of services or products that these companies can provide, okay? So governments will spend a lot of time looking at this. This is why we have competition policies and competition-related legislation that evolves into regulations to try to control monopolistic or oligopolistic systems, okay? Monopolies can be defined as exclusive control over a commodity or service in a private market, or control that makes possible the manipulation of prices. All right, so that's a harm. Definitely that's a harm to the consumer that regulation tries to address. But if that is not addressed, it's the regulation, the situation can lead to actually challenging the legitimacy, the public legitimacy of the capitalist system. So when we're regulating to control the harm of price gouging, we're also regulating to protect the market from perceptions that the market no longer works for the people. Okay, so that's that two-edged sword, right? That's the regulating for the public good, but also regulating to protect the market from itself. All right, and that's a key thing. Oligopolies is a market form in which a market or industry is dominated by small numbers of sellers, leading to higher prices for consumers. And we have oligopolistic systems, okay? But whenever possible, the government tries to prevent the monopolistic or oligopolistic systems from getting out of control for the two reasons I just stated: to protect the citizen from a market exploitation of an overly powerful entity that provides a necessary good or service, or a competitive good or service that people need to be fully integrated into the market economy, the modern economy, or whatever the case may be, education opportunities like the internet, so on, right? All of these things, the government will regulate to protect the citizen from those harms. But at the same time, regulation acts to defend the capitalist or free market system itself from becoming abusive to the point where maybe people start to rebel against that system. All right. So regulation always has those two dynamics. Remember before I talked to you about how regulation serves to protect from harms, but regulation also serves to define the access to the market and the rules that the market will have once a new technology hits that market. Okay. So you will often find corporations that will argue for you think it's strange. Here's a private company that's got a new technology that's arguing for regulatory clarity because they want to know what the rules are so that they can access the market. One, that it's legal and that it will stay legal as long as it performs according to these characteristics and so on, right? They want those rules, okay? At the same time, the citizens want rules that protect them from exposure to harms. So there's that two-edged dynamic of regulation, okay? And price collusion is a non-competitive agreement, usually illegal, between rivals that attempt to disrupt the forces of supply and demand. Now, you don't need, an oligopolistic system to have price collusion, but typically that's where it will occur because there's fewer numbers of providers. They have lower transaction costs to conspire either explicitly or implicitly in the price of a product or service. And the government, that's clearly against the law, okay? It's against, and there are regulations that the government has instituted to prevent that from happening. Again, that two-edged sword, to protect the citizen from exploitation and undue harm in that area, but also to protect the system itself from a loss of public legitimacy. Okay? So that's important to understand that dynamic in regulation, much the way we talked about public interest theory and private interest theory. We can see how these two, they're theories, they're ideal types for us to be able to draw comparisons, but we have to realize that they typically function together at all times. All right? Tendencies for market instability is another thing that the governments will focus on for regulation. Again, for the same two-edged sword reasons, right? Some markets that are very important to the health of a national economy are inherently unstable. For example, governments can be seen to introduce regulations to control risky financial practices in the stock market or lending, right? Right? So you can't just go to the bank and say, yeah, okay, give me $700,000 to buy my house, right? There are rules because the government doesn't want unnecessarily financial risk exposure in the economy, right? Stabilize uncontrolled price fluctuations. Governments typically will do that. They'll do that in various ways through supply agreements, through various things like the wheat board, milk marketing boards, quota systems, all kinds of different mechanisms are used for doing this, right? Prevent over or underproduction of key products or services, right? That's another area where where the government will focus. So when there are threats in this area, the government may bring in various actions to try to control this. They can control it through various ways, through agreements with industry, through regulating that a certain amount of quantity of something needs to be provided, by providing situations where, guaranteeing, say, the prices that farmers will get for their food, all of these kinds of things. They're very subtle things, but they're numerous examples of this across the economy. Stable is the market for vulnerable small and medium-sized companies in markets dominated by large corporate buyers. For example, the government may sort of put, by setting up a quota system, they can guarantee the price that the farmer or the producer of milk or cheese or whatever will get for their products, so that there's not, there's not mass fluctuations in the prices they can get, posing basically, from a corporate point of view, life-threatening sort of implications for small and medium-sized producers in particular, those people that produce all kinds of things from food products to lumber products to whatever the case may be. Governments will often step in to stabilize market vulnerability situations for small and medium-sized enterprises, okay? And we saw that in the recent debates over free trade, where the American government tried to sort of take away some of those protections for milk, for eggs, for these kinds of things. The same way earlier trade agreements tried to do it for the wheat board and things like that. But governments do have mechanisms where they try to make sure, particularly in areas where these goods or services are very strategic to national security, like on food production and things like that. Governments can step in to stabilize a market so that the small and medium-sized producers not taken advantage of by large corporate buyers. And I mean huge corporate buyers that can come into a market and basically dictate the price because there's nobody else to sell to. All right, and so governments, develop various regulatory ways of preventing that from becoming a threatening situation for small and medium-sized manufacturers, particularly in areas, or producers, particularly in areas where the product being produced is strategically very important for national security. All right. Missing markets is another area where governments will regulate, okay? The most prominent example of missing markets are in pure public goods, such as street lighting, military defense, and infrastructure, where governments will step in, or they'll step in with regulation. For example, if you are a developer of new land, let's say you bought a huge chunk of land, let's say you bought 800 acres just outside of the Ottawa area, right? And you wanted to develop that land into a housing project, obviously, a large housing project like Findlay Creek or Barrhaven or any of those large, very large residential development projects. The government will basically regulate that. If we'll permit you to develop that land according to specific regulatory requirements, but while you do that, in order for you to get our permit to develop that land, you must have a certain percentage that's park space, like for kids and for adults to go play softball and so on and so forth, right? Because without regulatory action, that would be a missing market, because the developer can make a lot more money by turning all of that land into a house, right? Into houses, row houses or whatever. So a regulation comes along to address a missing market. There are also other more substantial examples of that. Let's take cell phone service, mobile service in Canada, okay? So when the government issues its licenses to operate mobile and to have a frequency for your mobile service, they'll say, sure, yeah, we're definitely providing that, we're definitely auctioning that service off for Halifax, Montreal, Ottawa, Toronto, all the big guys right across the city. That's fine. That's great. Yeah, absolutely. But at the same time that you do that, you must provide at least a minimal service to certain areas in addition to. We know you're going to make buckets of money off of Toronto and Ottawa and Vancouver and places like that. So in return for that permitting, we want you to fill this missing market in an area where they would not otherwise have okay, cell phone services. The same thing occurs with buses, for example. A lot of the times when the government will issue permits for operating a busing service like a Greyhound or something like that, they'll often, as a proviso of that, they'll often want underserviced areas to provide it with at least some basic services. Same thing goes on with airlines, okay, with smaller airlines, okay. So these are the ways that government will regulate, okay, to ensure that missing markets that would otherwise not be serviced by a private sector company if they were making decisions purely on a profit motive. Those markets would never be serviced, okay? Those smaller markets would never be serviced, right? So private investors are unlikely to enter the market given the impracticality of charging enough money to make the investment pay, right? And that's what private companies do, right? So the government needs to find some way to change that equation, and the way they can do it is through permitting systems, licensing systems, and so on, and say, look, we know you're going to make a bucket of money here. We know that, all right? I mean, you're flying in and out of Toronto, you're going to make money on your short flights to Ottawa and to places like that. We know you're going to make money. So in return to that, we want you to, we're going to pressure you to at least do one flight a day to, say, Sault Ste. Marie or to a place like that that's somewhat underserviced, right? So these are the types of things that would go on to address the question of missing markets. And missing markets occur whenever, a government, it's the same thing we discussed in the private sector, public sector lecture, right? The private sector talked about what defines a public good, right? We talked about that. And whenever it's a public good that a private sector company cannot charge enough to make a profit from, or cannot charge at all, for the reasons of the characteristics of public goods, those are missing markets. Governments will move in to fill them. But where governments don't move in to fill them through investment, they will move in to fill some of those through regulation, okay? Licensing and permitting systems and so on, which are regulatory systems, okay? And then there's undesirable market results. And this is an area where most of our regulation kind of fits, all right? Undesirable market results for our purposes occur when market prices do not account for externalities, all right? Externalities occur when all costs associated with providing a product or service are not incorporated into the product or service price. Key costs to society or individuals are externalized from the price, right? We talked about, the t-shirts, right? We're going over, when I used to work in India, go over to India and buy 50 t-shirts for the same price that I could buy 2 or 3 here, right? Were they really cheaper, right? And we know they weren't, right? We know they weren't that much cheaper. Sure, labor costs a bit cheaper, but somebody's going to pay for that cheaper, right? And in the area of the environment, we know the environment pays heavily for that cheaper, right? And we know that the worker pays heavily for that cheaper, right? Compared to what it costs in Canada, where you're forced to pay at least a minimum wage, where you're forced to adhere to environmental regulations, and all those costs get internalized into the product price. So, of course, the product price is higher, right? But that's because it's beginning to reflect, and even in Canada, it doesn't reflect the full price. But, it gets much closer to the full price, let's say, than in other jurisdictions, right? So pollution, unsafe working conditions, and consumption of unsafe products, are all examples of market externalities, right? And so when we regulate for chemical products and their safety and efficacy, we're basically trying to regulate for externalities. We're trying to force the industry to incorporate the actual cost of production and use of a product into its product price, so it more accurately reflects what we should be consuming and what we should be careful with, right? Where we should be putting our money in areas that are safer for public health and the environment, right? And so and that's what most of what regulation in our field is. It's about, compelling an industry or a group or individuals to internalize the full cost of the production and use of the product or service, so that our money, the price better reflects, right, what's really going on out there in the market and in the environment, and then we make more reasoned choices about where we put our money, right? So that's the way we receive a lot of messages, right? You walk in the store and you see a price tag. It's amazing that even subconsciously all the messages that are running through your head, right? Well, this must be an expensive item. Or if I buy that, I'm not going to be able to afford to buy something else. Or I can buy that, but I'm going to use it sparingly. I'm going to take care of it because it's a little bit more expensive now than So all of those kind of things, are price signals in the marketplace. And when the price does not send the right signals, consumers do not, make necessarily the decisions that are consistent with their own safety or the safety of ecosystems, right? And so a lot of what we do in our area is regulating for undesirable market results or externalities. Okay. On that, I want to lay out that landscape so you understand that there's this broader scope, but also that you understand that, in all regulatory spheres, there's this dynamic where you're regulating, right? You're regulating to protect the public from a harm like unethical financial practices on the stock market or in banking or in insurance or whatever, or in our case, the production of a pharmaceutical or agrochemical or industrial chemical, whatever the case may be. You're protecting citizens from harm, but you're also regulating to establish the rules of the system that are publicly legitimate so that the system itself does not get called into question. Remember what I told you before about public legitimacy, right? Public legitimacy being so critical to regulation and to markets because of the need to maintain that public support and voluntary consent. All right? So on that score, I'll let you go, and we'll see you next time. Okay? Bye-bye for now.